Hello. We're so close to the end of this, I can't believe it. Can't believe it. I should probably send this to Destiny, she was asking. Hang on. I'm gonna disappear for 2 seconds. Hello, sorry about that. Oh, Destiny is here. I was gonna send it to her, but she's here already. Well, there you go. All right, all right. I didn't know who all was here because it only shows me that 2 people are here, and I know Becca's here, and I see Anya's here, and Destiny's here, but it's only showing me 2. We'll start in just a second. Just let a couple people, our regular book club folk, get on in. It's so weird because like I'm here too, but I can't see you. You can't see me? Can you see me? Now, of course, right as I get on here, the people doing the baby shower with me want to start texting, like literally right as I get on here. Weird, leave and come back. It only shows 2. Yeah, it's showing me 4 now. I guess it's just taking its time. I'm making cookies because my bananas are rotten. It's a good reason. It's a good reason. The screen is 100% dark. Is it dark for everybody? Should I get off and back on, or is it just for Haley? It may be because I had to. Nope, I see you. Okay, so it's just you, Haley. You had to scroll out for 2 seconds. Yeah, okay. I can see that the peoples are joining. It shows me 9 now, so it's catching up. It's catching up. Hey, Addie. Hey, Liz. All right, are we ready? Do we think we can finish this tonight? I don't know if we can finish it, but we can definitely, you know, get somewhere on it, you know? I don't know if we'll finish, but we'll definitely make some progress. And at the very least, we can finish tomorrow and then start John's book in Vegas. I don't leave until 4:45 p.m. tomorrow. Yeah. No, that number was because of me. I had to scroll turn back. Oh, I have the hiccups. Okay. Chapter 42. Are you sure you'll be all right on your own? Clara gripped the handle of her purse. I'll be fine, Lena said warmly. It was a few days after the scene at Scott's, and she, Clara, and Fitz were all on board the night ferry at Victoria Station. After the scene at dinner, Lena had felt terribly and said as much to Clara. She'd called Harry 4 times the next day, but he hadn't answered. Fearing the worst, Lena sunk into a stupor, worrying about what had happened and regretting her decision to keep it a secret. Then Clara suggested she go to Paris. They've already invited you to tour the school. It would be a good idea to get your mind off things. You can tell Harry all about it when you get back. I know, I've been thinking about it all day as well, and that's why I was like, I have to finish this. I can't wait any longer. So Lena had decided to go. She'd paid for a first-class cabin, the sleeper kind, which meant that her luggage was checked all the way through and that she had her own bed, meals, and an attendant who promised to update the Thompsons on Lena's journey and not let her leave Gare du Nord alone. I promised to ring you when I reach Paris. Hold on, I think I missed stuff. You missed stuff? What did you miss? What'd you miss? What did you miss? We read this morning here on YouTube. Here. All right. Peace. I promised to ring you when I reach Paris, Lena said. Give Harriet and Fitz Jr. a kiss for me. We will. Be safe. And Lena? He just needs time, Clara said. Thanks, Lena said, squeezing Clara's hands. We read here and you missed a lot. Yeah, we went through a lot this morning. We really did. We went through a lot. Yeah. Hold on, I gotta put this in somewhere where it'll stop falling out. As the train gathered speed, Lena looked out the window, waving to them. Goodbye, she called out. Goodbye. The emotional damage. Final stop, Gare du Nord. Lena stood up, trying to ease the crick in her neck. She'd been awake for a few hours, the anticipation of her meeting with the administration's director making it hard for her to sleep. She peered out the window, taking in the scene unfolding as the train came to a halt. Well-dressed travelers rushed back and forth on the platform outside, and the scent of petrol and coffee filled the air. A giant clock at the center of the terminal read 10 o'clock. With the help of the attendant, Lena gathered her things and managed to find a taxi. As they wove farther into the heart of the city, Lena ventured a few tentative phrases of French with the driver. By the time they reached her hotel, she felt comfortable enough to hold a conversation. The hotel was a small boutique one that Fitz had recommended. The first thing Lena did when she got to her room was yank open the curtains. Light streamed in, magnifying the dust mites as it fell in rectangular slant across the carpet. From the window, Lena could see the tip of the Eiffel Tower, and she stood, her hands pressed against the chilled glass of the pane, gazing at the beauty of the city, imagining what it would be like to wake up here each morning. A yawn escaped her mouth and she rubbed her eyes. Even though it was morning, she wanted to be fresh for her meeting with the administration director the next day. Lena climbed into bed and rested her head on the pillow and drifted off to sleep. The doorbell rang just as Fitz Jr. had fallen asleep for his afternoon nap. "Mrs. Thompson," Rose, the housekeeper, called out. "I'm putting the baby down," Clara replied. "Mr. Evans has come calling, says it might be important. I'll be down in a minute. Would you mind seeing him to the parlor and offering him some tea?" "Certainly." A few minutes later, Clara walked into the parlor, Harry's anxiety palpable before she even had a chance to greet him. He was standing stiffly by the mantel, a harried look on his face. Still, even under the stress, he didn't forget his manners, removing his Trilby hat when he saw her. "I'm sorry for showing up unannounced like this, Mrs. Thompson. I just need to see Lena." "Well, you're always welcome here, Harry. You know that, but Lena's in Paris visiting the school." Harry frowned. "Paris? By herself?" Clara sat down on the sofa. When Harry made no move to join her, she nudged him gently. "Harry," she said, pointing to the tea that Rose had brought in, "sit. Have some tea." "Yay! That's good, Addie." Harry opened his mouth as if to say something, but then shut it. His hair was uncombed and his clothing wrinkled. His eyes fell on a photograph of Fitz Jr. "They grow like weeds when they're young," Clara said, looking at the picture fondly. "I expect you and Lena will find that out soon enough. So, how's everything at the paper?" Harry shook his head sadly, sinking into the chair opposite Clara. "I know I've not behaved in the best manner the last few days." "It's all right. Lena understands." "She didn't even say she was applying. Why wouldn't she tell me?" "You know why," Clara said softly. "Would you keep telling people you were applying for something that kept turning you away?" Harry buried his face in his hands. "We're supposed to tell each other things." Clara placed her teacup gently on the china saucer, taking in the William Morris flowered pattern adorning it. "Lena thought that because you told her she should stop trying, that you didn't believe that she could do it." Harry laughed wistfully. "Not at all. She works so hard. I just wanted to give her a break and permission to know that I'd love her no matter what. I'm not criticizing you. If anything, I admire how supportive you are. The truth is, Lena needs this. She's always found success in her studies, especially when she was a child, and she didn't have success in other areas. And now she finds herself torn between two worlds. She doesn't want to choose." "Well, why didn't she say that?" "I'm not sure she knows," Clara replied quietly. Harry stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, studying the photograph of the Thompson family. "Do you know the reason that I applied for the assignment in India was for her? We've got our separate traveling stories, and I wanted to make our own memories. I wanted to hold her hand on a worn leather seat bench and a train to Madras. I wanted to watch a snake charmer and eat spiced nuts out of a newspaper comb with her in Delhi." He smiled as though he was reminiscing about a good time that had already passed. "I wanted to watch a Kerala sunrise, sipping hot spiced tea with her at my side. I wanted to photograph her framed by Haveli and hang the photos in the hallway of our new flat." "You can still do all those things," Clara urged. "You might just need to rethink the timing." Harry ran a hand through his hair and glanced at the clock. "You say she's in Paris?" Clara nodded. "Should I go? It can't be safe." Clara walked over to Harry and laid a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Let her concentrate on why she's there. She'll be back in a few days, and you can talk then. If you like, I'll leave a message at the hotel saying that we talked. Actually, hold on," Clara said, walking over to the desk in the corner. She scribbled down the phone number on the piece of paper and handed it to Harry. "Here, this is the number of the place she's staying. Why don't you ring her yourself?" "Thanks." Harry's eyes glittered as he took the piece of paper and put it in his breast pocket. "I'm not going to lose her. I love her." 20 minutes later, Clara was sitting down to review the school's financial records when the doorbell rang again. She heard Rose opening it and made a quick note to give her some extra pay. There had been far too many interruptions today for her to concentrate on her work properly. "Mrs. Thompson," Rose called up the stairs, "a gentleman caller's here asking for you." Harry, Clara thought. He must have left his hat. "It's not Mrs. Evans, ma'am," Rose said as if reading her mind. "Someone else. Says it's about Lena." Clara glanced anxiously at the clock. Lena had already called to say she'd arrived safely. If anything had happened to her, there would have been a phone call, not a personal visit. She walked out of her office to find Rose standing dutifully by the door. "He introduced himself as Alexander," she continued as Clara started down the stairs. "I thought he was dead." Clara stopped dead in her tracks, gripping the edge of the banister. "What did you say?" "Alexander. He said he was an old friend. Did I not say it right? He sounded French." Clara couldn't move. It had to be a coincidence. "Mrs. Thompson, are you all right?" Rose asked, wrinkling her forehead. "You're looking pale." "Are you sure that was his name?" "Quite sure. It's just not possible," Clara explained as they reached the front door. "The only Alexander that I know is dead." Rose shrugged apologetically as she pulled the door open, leaving Clara to stare back at the man standing before her. Oh my goodness. Alexander I thought Alexander was dead. The way that Theo was talking made it sound like he was dead, didn't it? Okay, we have to pause for 2 seconds because this baby shower chat is blowing up. Let me just answer them really quickly and tell them I'll be back in a second. But I'm not leaving this live. It's gonna pause for a second. I will return. I'm saying this 100 times because I know that okay. I am back. Is it registering that I am back? Somebody tell me if you can hear me now. They're just talking about drinks. It's totally unimportant. The more that they talk, the less I feel like they know her. It's really funny. They're like, "What if we got this and this and that?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." They were like, "What should we have for drinks?" I was like, "You should have lemonade and fizzy water because lemonade is her husband's favorite drink and she likes fizzy water." And they were like, "Okay, well, what if we get this instead?" I'm like, "Sure, whatever. Get whatever you want. Don't ask me if you don't want my opinion." You know what I mean? I'm like, that's what they drink. That's what they like. And she can't have alcoholic drinks because she's freaking pregnant. So she likes fancy fizzy water. That's what she's been drinking her whole pregnancy. It's going to make her feel comfortable. If we could have nugget ice, that'd be the best. I don't think it'll last. Anyway, let's get back to reading. Enough complaining. I sure do. One tries to eat your... Oh, I must have missed something. That sounds really intense. Anyway, chapter 43, all the fancy fizzy water. Yeah, for a pregnant lady, that's pretty much as good as it's going to get. She doesn't like tea. I mean, she does a little bit, but not really. Okay. Chapter 43. I know that it sells it, but how would we keep it? You know what I mean? I'd have to go buy a cooler or something, and I don't own a cooler. I don't have time to go buy one tomorrow. It's not that deep. It's going to be cold outside that morning anyway. Chapter 43. Alexander Robichaud stood shyly in front of Clara. He looked the same, albeit far removed from the awkwardness of adolescence. He raked a hand through his hair, which Clara noticed still had the same habit of falling into his eyes. "Hello, Clara. It's me," he said, his voice still carrying that unmistakable French lilt. Clara rested her head against the doorframe, closing her eyes. Maybe Rose was right. Perhaps she was running a fever. She opened her eyes again slowly, and he was still there. "Is it really you?" she whispered, knowing how stupid she sounded, but unable to believe the incredible turn of events. Alexander nodded, and a familiar shy smile tugged at his lips. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said nervously, "but I assure you it's me." His eyes caught the ring on Clara's left hand and smiled. "Belated congratulations are in order, I see." Clara shook her head. Forget congratulations, an explanation is needed. Come in, come in. Rose, she called out, would you mind making a fresh pot of tea? Alexander stepped over the threshold. It's not necessary. Nonsense! You're practically returned from the dead. I should think a bit of tea is the least I could do, she said, ushering him into the parlor. Once they'd settled down, tea in hand, Clara studied Alexander while simultaneously trying to collect the stream of thoughts racing through her mind. You'll forgive me my stunned reaction. You're the last person I expected to find on my doorstep this afternoon. It seems there was a misunderstanding about what happened all those years ago. Alexander stirred a bit of milk into his tea. I'm not sure misunderstanding is the right word. Colossal mistake is more like it. Suddenly, Clara sat up straighter. Hang on. If you're here, is Theo... Alexander stared into his cup. It's... He paused, struggling to find the right words. With all due respect, Clara, I owe it to Lena to tell her first. Theo was her father. Was her father? Crestfallen, Clara let his words think in. Of course. It's just for a moment I thought Lena would have everything back. She sighed wistfully. How on earth did you manage to find us? Alexander explained how he'd returned to London after escaping from the garrison town that he and Theo had been imprisoned in, only to discover that the world of wonders was no more. Eventually, I heard rumors that Horace had returned to London during the spring and summer. I confronted him one night at the Flask. Oh, it was him, not Theo. I thought it was Theo. We exchanged words, but I wasn't interested in revenge. All I wanted was to find Lena. Horace had told him she'd gone off to school, so he decamped for St. Ives, but when he got there, he learned that the school had shut down because of air raids and was still operating at a satellite location miles away. The interim headmistress at that place, he told Clara, had never heard of Helena Papadopoulos. After that, I came looking for you. I had your old address from Horace, but when I got to the house in Fulham, it was damaged. A young boy walking by told me that there'd been an airstrike, Steinbach, I think, and that there were a number of casualties. Clara nodded. Our house was hit. Mother and father decamped for the north, like so many of our neighbors. We couldn't risk staying, and Lena and I were away at school, though even that has changed. The war was just... Clara shuddered, remembering the horrors of what they'd all lived through. I asked if the boy had seen a girl with braces, and the boy said no, and then I knew it wasn't Lena. Actually, Clara began, clearing her throat and smiling, it probably was her. Alexander's eyes widened. But that would mean, yeah, it took years of therapy, but yes, Lena can walk unaided now. She can't run or cycle or do anything too taxing, but considering where she began... Clara shook her head. But I'll get to that. Tell me more. At that point, I had to leave. I was on the run myself, and I needed money. He had supported himself by performing one-man shows and opening for larger musical acts, slowly gathering experience and building up a consistent repertoire that wowed audiences over the years. But he never stopped looking for Lena. I couldn't accept that she disappeared like that. Alexander paused to rub his eyes. Then last month, Horace saw Lena's wedding announcement in the Daily Express. He sent it to me, and, well, here I am. He glanced around, a mixture of hope and nerves on his face. How is she? Is she well? Clara set her cup down on its saucer. She is. I'm afraid you'll have to wait a few more days to see her. She's in Paris. Clara's face spread into a wide grin, seeing Alexander surprised. I know, how ironic. She's been accepted into a medical school there. Alexander's face broke into an astonished smile. What? Clara nodded happily. She got in. I knew she would, Alexander said, beaming with pride. Mind you, it wasn't easy. She's certainly something. It's funny, though. As proud as she was about the walking, I think she's come to realize it was never about being able to walk, was it? It was about putting her mind to something and achieving it. And at some point, she realized it wasn't her so-called physical flaws holding her back. Her mind was always sharp. Clara looked pointedly at Alexander. We have you to thank for that. You came in and turned her life upside down. Well, when does she return? The weekend. Clara hesitated before proceeding. Alexander, you're aware she's engaged. That announcement wasn't a lie. She watched Alexander's face closely, and for a split second she could have sworn she detected a hint of sadness, but the student had become the master, and Alexander continued as if nothing had changed. I would never have expected her to wait, but There's something important I must tell her. He glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. I've got to get back to Paris immediately. Clara leapt up to stop him. Alexander, don't. You simply can't walk into her life unannounced after years away. She's not prepared for it. She nodded towards the sofa. Why not stay here? I'll have Rose. But Alexander was already fastening his coat. I've waited 10 years. I'm not wasting another minute. Now, could I trouble you for the address to her hotel? Fascinating, the admissions director said, ushering Lena out onto the hallway the next afternoon. Miss Thompson, your achievements are most remarkable. I do hope to see you in the autumn. I wish you a safe journey back to London. Thank you, Lena said, waiting until she returned to his office to take her leave. She took the lift down to the ground floor and then waited for a moment, watching the students at the university enter and exit the building, books clutched to their chests. She felt a ripple of joy when she imagined joining them in a few months' time. As the cab driver drove back to the hotel, Lena thought about how she was going to spend the remainder of her time in Paris. She'd allowed herself a few extra days to reacquaint herself with the city after Clara urged her to take a holiday. Lena already knew her first stop would be Sauteur, a cafe that she used to frequent with her father. It had been a childhood favorite, and the nerves that she had before the meeting had left her incapable of keeping down a full meal. A nice café au lait and a pastry would do just the trick. And then off to admire the glittering glass of the Sainte-Chapelle or the colorful carousel of Montmartre, followed by a baguette from Au Grand de Richelieu. But before all that, she needed to ring Clara from the hotel. She'd be dying to know how the meeting went. After she paid the cab driver, Lena pushed through the hotel doors and walked to the concierge desk. Bonjour, I'd like to make a call to London. Can I do so from my room? Mademoiselle, I'll give you the instructions, but first a gentleman has arrived for you, the concierge said. Lena's heart fluttered, but she scanned the lobby hopeful, thinking Harry must have jumped on a train, but she couldn't spot him anywhere. Confused, she began another sweep of the lobby, wondering if the concierge had mistaken her for someone else. Here are the dialing instructions, the concierge said, holding out a slip of paper. But Lena wasn't listening anymore, because she'd seen him. Except it couldn't be him, because he was gone. The lack of sleep must be getting to her, she thought. It wasn't possible. He was dead. And yet there he was, not 2 steps away. And that was enough for her legs to give out, and she began falling to the floor. The last thing she remembered was hearing her name on his breath. Can you even imagine? I cannot even imagine. I cannot even imagine. It's okay. We're okay. We'll be fine. We'll be fine. We're going to make it. We're going to make it through this. Chapter 44. A few hours later, Lena's eyelids fluttered open. It took a minute for the scene before her to register, but when it did, she rolled over and pulled the covers over her head, afraid of how real his presence felt. He was gone, she told herself. She held his mother's necklace in her hand, but something inside her was telling her otherwise, and so she sat up and slowly turned around. Alexander, her sweet, mischievous Alexander, was dozing in the armchair that flanked the opposite side of the bed. Lena pinched herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming and then crawled quietly over the bedspread toward him, too curious to resist. When she was just a few inches away, she reached out and touched his hair. Alexander? He stirred, and Lena quickly withdrew her fingers. His eyes opened, and seeing her awake, his face stretched into a sleepy smile. Lena's hands flew to her mouth in shock. Lena, Alexander said, leaning forward, is it really you? She nodded in disbelief, 10 years of sorrow and guilt rising within her. But you were gone. The fire. We survived it. Slowly, Lena unfolded her legs from underneath her and stood up, trying to take all of him in. His skin was paler than she remembered, and his jawline was sprinkled with stubble. His hair was still cut on the long side, and he hadn't lost the habit of flopping into his brilliant blue eyes. Although his face now sported hard lines that age and experience brought, his smile still had that childlike quality that she had found so endearing as a young girl. She noticed he was pointing at her, and she looked down at her body for signs of distress. What's wrong? Clara said, but I never. He looked at her, momentarily overcome with emotion. You can walk. Lena smiled bashfully. Yes, Overwhelmed, she began to cry. I thought you were dead. All these years, I thought you and Papa. She stopped. Her father. She searched Alexander's eyes eagerly. Is he here? Alexander's face hardened and he walked to the window to gaze out at the buildings. Lena followed him, noticing that the sun was now lower in the sky. She must have been asleep for hours. It's okay, she said, trying to convince herself to believe her own words. At least you're safe, she said, squeezing his shoulders. Alexander stiffened at her touch and pulled away, avoiding her eyes as he walked to the bed and sat down, burying his head in his hands. Lena's lower lip trembled as she joined him. She was almost too afraid to ask, unwilling to let him confirm the worst. You don't have to talk about it yet, she whispered supportively. Alexander frowned, lifting his head. It's not that. Then what? Your father. Lena waited with bated breath, anticipating his next words, and when he said nothing, she braced herself for the terrible truth. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I can handle it. Alexander took a deep breath before forcing himself to look at her. He's here. Theo is alive. What? What? You couldn't have convinced me that this is what was going to happen. You could not have convinced me that this was what was going to happen. I'm so glad we decided to read this tonight because I would not have been able to sleep not knowing what this is. We have to keep going. We have to keep going. Like, that's it. That's it. We're going. I'm sorry. We're going right now. Lena wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. I beg your pardon. He's alive, Alexander continued, his voice low and gravelly. But he doesn't know I found you. After I got the clipping. What clipping? Alexander pulled the newspaper article out, announcing her engagement to Harry from his pocket and handed it to her. You had a different name. The photo, it looks like you, but I wanted to be sure it was you before I told Theo. We've had a few near misses over the years, and each time it was heartbreaking, getting our hopes up only to discover we were wrong. Lena didn't know how to react. After all these years, she was getting a second chance to make everything right. He's in Paris? He's really here? Is he okay? Alexander nodded, and she jumped up trembling. She grabbed her purse and flung her coat over her shoulders. Please, you must take me to see him. I will, but... Alexander hesitated. What, is he injured? No, he's not injured. Alexander shook his head and gestured to her outfit. You just have to change your clothes. Lena's jaw fell in disbelief. I don't think he's going to care what I'm wearing. He won't, but Count de Bessieux surely will. According to Alexander, Theo was due to perform that evening at a lavish masquerade ball being thrown by one of Europe's most eccentric millionaires. But I've nothing to wear. Alexander pointed to a box in the corner of the room. It's all taken care of. Lena opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it. Still feeling like she was lost in a dream, she grabbed the box and went to the washroom. Her brain was spinning, and she didn't really have time to even focus or think about changing. But if it was the only way to see her father again, she would have to do it. She opened the box, and her eyes widened at the contents. On top sat a navy blue half mask and a spiral of golden feathers flanking the right side, arching up in a half-moon curve. Golden thread created a subtle damask pattern across the bottom half. Tiny golden pearls dotted the rim, and a thick blue velvet ribbon was attached to each side. That's why he had to get back to Paris so quickly. It wasn't just this. The dress came next. Oh, she said softly, removing it from the box. It was midnight blue and trimmed with gold accents. She quickly removed all her clothes and slipped into it and spun herself around to look in the mirror. He probably got her size from Clara. The iridescent material was scrumptious, shimmering even in the dim washroom light. She fluffed the skirt, noticing tiny golden drop pearls scattered throughout. When she looked more closely, she realized that they were the outlines of constellations. She traced the path of Cernius up and down her torso. The last thing inside the box was a pair of blue velvet slippers laced with braided gold trim. She felt a pang of love for Alexander as she saw them, touched that he had thought of her to get her a pair of comfortable shoes that she could walk in. As she emerged from the washroom, she heard Alexander take a breath. He was holding a midnight blue Batu mask in one hand. His shirt and trousers were midnight blue and accented with bursts of white, and there was a tiny gold-threaded constellation on his right breast. She pointed to it, incredulous. "Colombe?" Alexander said as he reached into his pocket and produced Lena's dove bracelet. "Even though you were hard to find, I never stopped believing that I would see you again," he explained, taking her hand and slipping it onto her wrist. Lena twisted her wrist, admiring it, and suddenly remembered Alexander's mother's necklace. "Wait," she said, rummaging through her purse until she found it. She picked it up and placed it delicately in his palm. Alexander gasped as his eyes fell on the necklace. "How did Horace?" "They found it in the fire, and I couldn't bear to part with it." "Thank you," he said, his voice wavering. "Now come, we've no time to waste." As they settled into a taxi and headed west, Lena clasped Alexander's hands. "Tell me everything. Leave nothing out." And so he began. He told her about the contract and Theresienstadt, about the performances and the absurd talent wasted within the town walls. He explained that the Nazis had built a model town that he was certain the residents who left on the train later killed. "It was horrible." Alexander's face clouded over. "But I wanted to leave the minute we arrived. I didn't trust anyone, but Theo insisted we stay for the sake of your safety. He was so worried that they'd find you and hurt you if we dared break the rules." And then he explained what had happened when they tried to leave after their contract expired. "Once Theo realized they had no intention of releasing us, we made a plan. We couldn't leave when they were expecting us to, so we did it when they'd least expect, right in the middle of an illusion." He described the water tank, the train timetable, the rehearsal with Berger, and the brandy. Lena noticed when he spoke of a girl named Like that his hand floated to a wooden rose pendant hanging around his neck. "We were almost in the clear, and then we got to the train." Alexander's face darkened. "Attila had figured out our plan and tipped off a Czech guard in exchange for his freedom." Alexander shuddered. The image of Attila lying in the blinding white snow with his blood spilling out next to him forever etched into his mind. The bullet from the guard's gun hit Like's shoulder, and so I put her in a train car to keep her safe. And then the train started to move, and I told Theo to go. I managed to injure the guard, but just as I was jumping onto the carriage, he fired at us, injuring Theo. I told him and Like to hold on, that Prague wasn't far away, but... Alexander's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to continue. "I promised to look after her, Lena, but she was already sick." He gripped the pendant harder. "I took them both to the hospital as soon as we reached Prague. Theo's wound was severe, but with enough care and rest, they said he'd be fine. Like, on the other hand, she'd lost so much blood, and she'd been sick for weeks before. She died not long after they admitted her." Lena reached out and hugged him. Wait. Oh, I found a typo. It says, Lena reached out and hugged Theo as they sat in silence, but it's not Theo, it's Alexander. Oh, that's a typo. It says Theo. It's not Theo, it's Alexander. After a few minutes, she pulled back and asked him how he found her. Alexander repeated the explanation he had given to Clara, detailing the trip to St. Ives and the visit to Clara's family home in Fulham and the drive to Dorset. "I knew you had to be somewhere, so I kept trying." We both did. Once Theo healed, he went to Horace, badgering him for information about your whereabouts. Ah, so it was Theo in the bar. Yep. "We never stopped searching. 3 years ago, Theo and I contacted all the universities we thought you might be at. Cambridge, UCL, Guy's, but they wouldn't give out personal information. We never would have guessed that you'd be teaching in London, and then Horace contacted me." Lena's face paled at the sound of his name. "Horace?" Alexander nodded. I told him to contact me if he'd heard anything, and I suppose he did one right thing after all. He paused, scratching the fabric of the seat. Maybe, but Ally Stroker can't walk. So we can't really have Ally Stroker be adult Lena because adult Lena can walk. You know? We tried to find you, Lena. We tried so hard, but it was like you ceased to exist. Lena thought back to the day she sat in the adoption office, telling the official to change her name. I didn't know. Once I saw the newspaper clippings, I knew I had to see you, so I came to London. Clara said you'd be back in a few days, but I couldn't wait. I didn't know if you'd want to see me, given the circumstances, he said, glancing at her ring, but I had to try, if only for Theo. A few minutes later, the taxi pulled up outside the palatial rectangular building. Lena craned her neck, reading the sign that hung outside. Alexander, she protested. They were at the infamous Piscine Montelaire, the outdoor Lido, where the world of wonders had often hosted show parties. Sometimes on their days off in Paris, her father would bring her here, holding her up by the waist in the water as she laughed, the sun shining down on her from above. Alexander turned to her, a serious expression on her face. Lena, promise me one thing. Anything, she said. Give your father a chance to explain. He's not a bad person. Lena nodded understandingly. If it's about the affair with Isabella, it's all right. I knew, remember? It's fine. I'm just relieved he's alive. Alexander looked at her, a troubled expression on his face. Just promise you'll give him a chance. All right, Lena said, looking at him strangely. He exhaled a sigh of relief and then nodded towards the building. Shall we? Lena stepped out, taking care not to trip on the cobblestones, and followed Alexander through the doors. As she entered the lobby, her eyes widened. Austerity, it seemed, was not among the Count's best traits. Hordes of partygoers clad in costumes and masks so extravagant they reminded her of the circus swarmed the lobby. Flashbulbs went off every few seconds as society mavens posed and preened for the cameras. Is it always like this? She asked, lifting her mask to her face. Trust me, he said from behind his mask, leading her up the staircase that she now remembered led to the main deck. You haven't seen anything yet. When they reached the main deck, Alexander pushed a black curtain to reveal the pool area, and Lena gasped. All around her, a nautical-themed party and performance was in full swing. The deck had been transformed into a dynamic, outdoor, interactive theatrical playground for what seemed to be the wealthiest of Parisian society. In the center of it all was the world-famous pool. It was filled to the brim with clear blue water that had flickered brightly each time the white lights pulsated beneath its surface. In the middle of the pool, swimmers wearing navy and white striped swimsuits and matching swim caps created pinwheels and stars as partygoers whistled. To the left, a live band played as people danced. To the right, a giant glass aquarium filled with baby tiger sharks swimming about had attendees oohing and awing. Do you like it? Alexander, Lena began. She'd spent years avoiding anything to do with the circus, the excess, the wonderment, the world of pretend. She'd avoided it on purpose, lest it bring back too many painful memories. And yet, standing here in front of the scene filled her with an energy she hadn't known she was missing. Did you do all of this? No, this is all the Count. Much of this, he swept his arm over the scene, is modeled off Le Bal Oriental. It's the most incredible party ever thrown, according to many. Does this happen often? There are smaller salons every few months, but the Count throws a few grand parties like this one every year. And during the war, no change. He identifies as Spanish and is the heir to a Mexican mining company. He was basically neutral during the war. A couple dressed as Antony and Cleopatra walked past them, and then Lena felt a hand against her back. Oh, she asked as a masked gentleman dressed as a joker in shades of rust and mustard yellow tried to pull her into an embrace. Alexander stepped forward. She's with me. Shrugging, the joker skipped off to find another lady to claim. Arlecchino, the main character in the Italian theater tradition known as Commedia dell'arte, Alexander explained, taking her hand. They wandered to the far end of the pool where two bartenders dressed in navy uniforms with shiny gold buttons and jaunty white caps poured champagne into twinkling slim flutes studded with Swarovski crystals. 2 glasses, Alexander said, handing one to Lena. He noticed she was scanning the deck. He's in the green room. They set up a changing area. He's due to go on any minute. If you want me to take you... Lena shook her head. No. We'll wait, she replied, secretly relieved that she'd have a chance to observe Theo before speaking with him. After so many years, it didn't make sense that she'd want to wait any longer, and suddenly, she didn't know what to say. The synchronized swimmers finished their routine and were now wrapping themselves in silky white bathrobes, their teeth gleaming against the apple-red lacquer on their lips. Below the pristine sheen of the water, a performer appeared to be rising, and Lena glanced at Alexander as they found seats on the chaise lounges set around the pool's perimeter. Is he... Alexander nodded. Lena sucked in her breath as the performer emerged out of the water. It was covered in a slate-gray glitter and resembled a tiny rock island shining under the moonlight. Lena felt her skin prickle, and she gripped Alexander's hand in anticipation as the lights dimmed all around them. A moment passed, and they came back up, revealing a figure standing at the center of the rock, alone. It was Theo. Her father was dressed in a lavish white and gold Sun King costume, his face obscured by a Volto mask. But it was him. She could see it in the way that he moved, the deft touch of his hand, the charisma with which he commanded the audience. The melodic strains of a group of string instruments pierced the night sky, and Lena looked up. A cello quartet was performing on the balcony directly above Theo. She watched as he seemed to become one with the music, moving his body slightly, and then, without warning, a shot of water rose, perfectly timed with a crescendo in the piece, and Lena gasped. Theo was using water and music to create a completely immersive illusion. He shifted and moved, making droplets rise and fall around him, lost in his own world. For the finale, Theo created what Lena could only describe as a symphony of water. First, he waved his arms as though coaxing a living, breathing organism out of the pool. And then he made the water form a semicircle that arched over the platform. He repeated this until there were 8 small arcs and one big one right in front of him. Lena could tell that the music was coming to an end, and the top note of one of the last bars, Theo waved his arm, forcing the big arc to corkscrew out from the bottom of the pool and rise to the very top of the veranda above. The crowd gasped and leaned back, the immediate reaction not wanting their couture to get wet. And yet the water didn't leave its place. With a flourish, Theo waved his arm, and a frigid stream of air plunged across the deck, freezing the water in its tracks. The audience erupted in cheers and looked up, pointing at what Theo had just done. The majestic corkscrew was still frozen, spiraling up like the top of a glass skyscraper. The 8 arcs had stopped mid-air, and beams of blue and yellow protruding from the lights around the pool were now dancing through them. For his final move, Theo rose one last time and snapped his fingers. Immediately, the frozen water melted, but remained perfectly in motion, nary a drop out of place. The crowd erupted into electrifying applause, startling Lena. She watched her father take a gallant bow, and then the lights went dark as he moved from the platform back to the deck. Lena felt Alexander gently tug at her elbow, urging her to get up. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" she asked, suddenly frozen. Alexander shook his head. "That's not ever going to be the case. He thought about you every single day since you split apart. Come," he said, extending his hand. Lena took it, and they walked through the crowd, overhearing the guests praise the magical scene that they'd just witnessed. When they were but a few feet away from Theo, Alexander stopped and turned to Lena. "I'm not saying what you're about to hear will be easy, but you shouldn't for a moment ever doubt his love for you." He brushed a wisp of her hair off of her mask and then stepped forward to greet Theo as he came striding for them. "A fine performance, sir," he said jovially. "Alexander!" Theo embraced him. "You should have told me you'd be here. We could have performed together." Lena swallowed. His voice, he spoke with the same gentle, reassuring tone that he'd always used. I'm not here on business matters, I'm afraid," Alexander said, gesturing to Lena. Lena bristled, waiting for Theo to react as he looked at her, but his face was blank, save for a smile. Her mask, she thought. He wouldn't have recognized her yet. I was wondering what was keeping you so busy these days. Theo moved forward and reached for Lena's hands. She drew back, panicking. Theo shook his head. Of course. How silly of me. He untied his mask, revealing a face that was so familiar and yet changed. He still had the same kind brown eyes that sparkled, the same slim nose and broad smile with dimples in his cheeks. But she noted flecks of gray in his once dark brown hair and faint lines settled into his forehead. His strong jawline was no longer as defined, but he was still handsome, still the man she looked up to. Alexander cleared his throat. Why don't we all sit down, he suggested, leading them to Theo's dressing room. Theo looked perplexed. What's going on? He asked as they all walked into the space and Alexander shut the door. Alexander opened his mouth, preparing to launch into an explanation, but Lena stepped forward. It was now or never. Reaching behind her head, she untied her mask and faced her father. Papa? She said softly. Lena? Theo's voice was barely audible. He shook his head, stunned. But how? I found her, sir, Alexander said. Lena! Theo took 2 big strides forward and pulled Lena into an embrace, his body shaking with emotion. She broke down in tears and felt his strong arms around her. She'd missed that feeling so long. Theo pulled back and stroked her cheek as if discovering her for the first time. They laughed through their tears. Is it you? He shook his head in disbelief. My dear girl, you can walk? Yes, Papa, it's me, and yes, I can walk, she said, gripping his wrist, not wanting to take her eyes off him. How long I've waited for this day, he whispered. Lena noticed his dark eyes widening as she raised a hand to tuck a lock of hair behind her ear. You're engaged? She nodded. Congratulations, what a joyous occasion. He is a lucky man. I'll leave you two alone. Alexander exchanged a glance with Theo. Theo and Lena looked at each other, unsure of what to do or say. Finally, Theo gestured to one of the chairs in the room. Please, sit, he said, admiring her. We have much to discuss. Lena gathered the skirt of her dress and sat down. Papa, Alexander said, don't be angry with him. He's done nothing but protect me. Theo sighed, and Lena could tell he was about to begin an explanation she didn't want to hear. I know what happened, but it was a mistake, and I forgive you. All I want is for us to be a family again. Lena, please, it was Isabella, right? The lady from the letters? I don't care what you did. You've suffered enough, Lena said, her eyes shining. She'd only just gotten him back, and she didn't want to lose him because of a past transgression. Theo shook his head firmly. Lena, you don't understand. I never did anything to hurt your mother. Lena frowned. But the letters, I read them. Theo took her hand in his and looked directly in her eye. That's not what I lied about. He paused and took a deep breath. The truth is, Lena, I'm not your father. There were few incidents in Lena's life that stood out above the rest. Significant, life-altering moments, if needed, could be brought to the forefront of her memory and relived like they had only just happened yesterday. One was the day she'd met Alexander. Another was the day her father and Alexander were captured. Another was the day she'd received her acceptance letter to medical school. And of course, she couldn't forget the day she met Harry. Today, the day she found out that her father, whom she thought was dead for the last 10 years, wasn't really her father, would be added to that list. Lena felt herself shrink away from Theo, and then she blinked, shaking her head. She couldn't hear him correctly. Excuse me? I'm not your real father, Theo said softly. I never was. Gia was my sister. You're my uncle? Theo nodded. I'm Gia's older brother. Lena stood up abruptly, feeling like the entire world was collapsing. Of all the things she'd expected Theo to say, she hadn't considered this. It makes no sense, she said, pacing back and forth in the small space. Have you been lying to me my entire life? Theo nodded ruefully and stood up. Please, Lena, I'm so sorry, but I had my reasons for doing what I did. Will you at least listen to my explanation? Lena stared at him dazed. She didn't know what to think. Now she understood what Alexander had meant when he told her to give him a chance. She shook her head and finally took a seat. Okay, she managed to say, still stunned. Thank you, Theo said. He poured 2 glasses of water from a carafe and handed one to her. Then he shrugged himself out of the stiff white and gold jacket he was wearing, draped it across the back of his chair, and sat down. I think it's best if I start from the beginning. Your mother and I were raised in a fairly liberal, at least at the time, household in Athens. Our father was a diplomat and valued education above everything, and he always gave me a hard time because I never had the head for traditional schooling, but Gia was different. She could read by the time she was 3 and was writing complete sentences before her 5th birthday. Though 2 years behind me, she was much smarter. She excelled in school and brought this pride and joy to our father. Despite my best efforts, I didn't have a talent for academics. I don't think my father ever forgave me for that. Theo paused to collect his thoughts. Gia filled the void in his life that I had created. That is until she reached the age of 18. That was when most Greek girls were married off, and despite his forward-thinking mindset, our father eventually succumbed to societal pressures and began looking for a suitable husband for her. I had left for school a few years earlier, convinced I was better off without it. I left school. I loved magic and performing, and I practiced for hours each day. Eventually, I started picking up gigs on the weekends, performing at birthdays and anniversary parties, while working as a carpenter to pay my bills. When I was 18, I joined a tour and traveled all over Greece and parts of Europe. It rattled my parents to have to tell their friends that their son had effectively joined the circus, but it was what I wanted. Still, it meant leaving Gia behind. We were always so close, and I missed her terribly. Theo reached for a handkerchief on his dressing room table and mopped at the sweat that had gathered on his forehead. Lena had forgotten how hot the spotlights could get, especially under all the stage makeup. Still, life went on. 2 years into the tour, I had built up a good amount of money and a solid reputation. I'd also fallen in love, he said, his face brightening. I'd met a young woman in the show in Madrid one night. Her name was Isabella. Though she wasn't part of the circus, we rode to each other every week and quickly fell in love. Theo ran his hands over his thighs as though bracing himself for something painful. Unfortunately, she came from an aristocratic family in Spain, and as our father had with Gia, hers had begun searching for a suitable match. She wrote to me regularly saying that she wanted to run away, and I told her to stay put, that I would come for her once the tour ended, after which we'd elope. But I never made it. Lena interrupted him. Wait, is this the Isabella from the letter? Theo nodded. But what happened? Why did you have to pretend to be my mother's husband? Gia called me one evening distraught. She'd been admitted to university a few months back, and together we'd managed to convince our father to let her keep attending classes until they'd found a good boy from a good family. But during this time, one of her university tutors had taken a shine to her. It wasn't hard to fall for Gia. She was stunning and brilliant, and this particular man said he would marry her and let her continue to study for as long as she liked. Theo's face darkened. My sister was smart, but she was also naive. They began a relationship, and she soon discovered he was already married with 2 children. That was the night she phoned me bereft. She was pregnant with you and said the man she had been seeing refused to acknowledge your existence once she told him and never wanted to see her again. She was terrified of what our parents would say, and I couldn't blame her, but I knew we had to tell them. She couldn't hide her pregnancy forever, so I took a leave of absence and returned to Athens. Theo shuddered. I'll never forget the look in my father's eyes when we told him. He'd always considered me a disappointment, but to find out his little girl had failed him too, it was too much. He forbade us from ever returning, saying that if we were going to defy his expectations, we had to live with the consequences. I'm so sorry, Lena said, thinking how awful it would have been. The next day, Gia and I left. I quit the tour and wrote a letter to Isabella explaining what had happened, promising to return to Madrid when I could. And then Gia and I traveled north to Thessaloniki, where you told everyone you were a married couple, Lena said, filling in the gaps. Theo nodded. We stopped in Larissa on the way to get a fake marriage certificate. Your mother chose Thessaloniki because it was far enough away from Athens that no one would recognize us. They'd also just opened a university, and she'd hoped to return to her studies once she was able, even if she had to do it alongside raising you. She wanted to be a lawyer, Theo said, smiling at Lena. What happened next? Well, we settled into a routine. I continued performing locally, and Gia acclimated to life in Thessaloniki beautifully. Theo's gaze flickered. But things with Isabella hit a bump. She wrote to me saying that she'd been promised to a man from a wealthy family living in Seville. This was against her will, of course, and I was devastated. But he was abroad for business, and her wedding wouldn't take place for at least a year. I still had time. I didn't know how, but I promised Isabella we'd be together, and I was determined to find a way before she was lost forever. About 3 months before you were due, Horace visited the city and saw me perform. He offered to take us on board his new circus. Gia and I discussed it and decided it would be a good idea for everyone. I could keep an eye on both of you. Remember, your mother was only 18, and Horace would provide the best of everything, plus a hefty salary that would let me set up Gia properly in Thessaloniki. I wrote to Isabella explaining the situation and asked if she would also join me on board at some point. What did she say? She was overjoyed, so she came to see me, Theo said. Now that she was betrothed, her father had relaxed his rules a little. She convinced her older sister to cover for her and came to Thessaloniki. We had but 2 days together, and it was the most magical time of my life. Released from prying eyes of those who knew her, we roamed freely all over the city. Adelpha, Lena said, thinking back to the day in Aristoteles Square when she and Alexander had run into Adelpha and heard her prophetic words, "Do not fall for his act. He's a good showman, that Theodorus." She saw you with Isabella. Theo nodded. We spent the day and night together. Even though we knew it was wrong, it felt right. We were meant to be. And as I dropped her off at the train station, I told her it wouldn't be long until I saw her again. Theo's face darkened. About 6 weeks before she was due to give birth, Gia fell violently ill with typhoid. It was the worst time of my life to see my bright, beautiful sister fighting so hard. And not only for her life, but yours too. It nearly undid me. Theo looked like he might cry. I took her to the best hospital in Thessaloniki, and the doctors tried everything, but it was no use. She had been fighting her whole life for acceptance and was done. You were her final gift to the world. Lena felt a lump in her throat. But things weren't over yet. You were 5 weeks away from being full term, so it was risky to deliver you, but Gia insisted. You made it through, alive, but very weak. Things got worse from there. Your immune system and body were underdeveloped, and after only 2 days at home, we had to move you to a hospital with an incubator. And it was a month before I was allowed to touch you again. I hated having to leave you in there. It was so unsanitary and ill-equipped for a sick child, but what could I do? I didn't have any of that equipment at home, and you were too unstable for us to transport you to a hospital in Athens or somewhere like Paris or London. And after 3 months, the doctors finally deemed it safe enough for you to travel, so we left. What about Isabella? Lena asked. You never contacted her again? Theo smiled softly. After you were born, I had a choice to make. But seeing you in your mother's arms, it wasn't really a choice. From the moment I met you, it didn't feel like a sacrifice. I had to do it. I wrote to Isabella a few hours after you arrived, and I told her I had to think of you, and after this, she couldn't contact me. His eyes grew misty as he reminisced about his love. I thought it best to break it off quickly, but she was selfless and refused to give up on our love. She wrote back saying that she understood and that she'd wait for me as long as it took. But her fiancé returned early and she had no choice but to marry him. I wrote to her sister telling her how sorry I was. I promised I would still come for her one day. He paused and looked at Lena. But you never did, she said sadly. No, I did. But it was too late, Theo said, his eyes heavy. After Alexander and I escaped, I ended up in a hospital in Prague. I promised myself that if I healed, I would stop living my life in fear, and I knew Alexander was already searching for you, so on my way back to London, I stopped in Seville. Lena held her breath. And? Theo shook his head sadly. She was gone. Most of the people I spoke with said she died during childbirth many years ago. But that evening, as I sat drinking at one of the local taverns, her maid came to see me. She said it wasn't childbirth that had killed Isabella, but rather a broken heart. Lena fiddled guiltily with the pendant pearls on her dress. She'd been the reason that Theo hadn't been able to be with his true love. Theo noticed her expression. It's not your fault. I made my choice too late. Lena sat silently for a minute, letting the news settle. Why didn't you just tell me the truth when I was old enough? Then you could have gone to Isabella and gotten married and brought her along with us. Theo looked down at his hands. Your mother made me promise 2 things before she died. The first was to ensure that you got an education, and the second was never to tell you the truth about who I was. She'd kept my affair with Isabella a secret, and so to keep her secret was only fair. It was the least I could do. She knew that if people thought you were my daughter, they'd treat you in a more favorable light than if they thought you were the child born to an adulterer. She didn't want you growing up with a shadow of what she'd done following you around. As for why I went along with it, Theo said, wincing with the pain of an old wound flaring up again. My father abandoned us. He let his pride get in the way of loving his own flesh and blood, and I promised myself if I ever had a child, I wouldn't do that. He shuddered. He could be difficult at the best of times, but he was still my father, and there was nothing I could do to change that your mother was gone, but at the very least, I could be a good father. Lena didn't know what to think. Her life, as she knew it, had been a lie, but Theo had been untruthful out of love. All those years, he had never said a bad word about Gia. He'd never wanted Lena to think ill of her mother. There's one more thing, he said apprehensively. The reason I was so hesitant to let you pursue an education, even though Gia insisted upon it, was because I'd seen how the girls were treated by men in positions of power, and I couldn't bear the thought of what happened to Gia happening to you. I think on some level, he trailed off and paused to take a deep breath. I blame myself for having lost her. If I hadn't encouraged my father to let her study, she might still be here. And after she died, I decided too many risks, no matter the potential reward, were not worth it. Now I can see I was wrong. That's why you were so upset about boarding school, Lena said, finally realizing her father's true motives. Theo nodded miserably. I thought it would be enough for you to learn from within the circus walls, but you had your mother's spirit. It was a mistake to hold you back, and I'm so sorry. Lena sniffled and searched the room for a handkerchief. Theo pulled one out and handed it to her. I know. He paused, trying to find the right words. I know this is a lot to take in, but please know that all I've ever thought of was you as my own daughter. And even now that you know, nothing has to change. Lena reached out and hugged Theo tightly, relishing the feeling of his arms safely around her. I'll let you get dressed, she said, but will you meet me at my hotel tomorrow? It will give us a chance to speak more. Theo smiled. I'll be there first thing in the morning. Papa, she said, gazing up at the man who raised her, thank you for being honest. She hugged him one last time and then wandered back to the middle of the party where she found Alexander chatting with one of the bartenders. Everything all right? He asked, leading her to sit on one of the lounge chairs. Lena placed her chin in the palm of her hands and leaned forward. It is a lot to take in. Alexander rubbed her back affectionately. Around him, the party was winding down, and Lena yawned and checked the clock. It was past midnight. I should get back to the hotel. The night is young, Alexander said with a twinkle in his eyes. Theo's meeting me in the morning. I spent all this time searching for you, and you won't let me have one night? Alexander asked playfully. Lena stared at him, willing herself to make the right decision. It didn't seem fair that she had a chance to be with him now. She twirled the ends of her mask in her hands. I'm engaged. Alexander rolled his eyes. Engaged, not dead. When Lena didn't reply, he pressed on. Come on. Where's that girl who ran through the streets of Barcelona and stole a bottle of Bollinger and wouldn't let me go? And suddenly Lena plummeted back in time to a place she tried hard to forget. Flashes of that hot night in Barcelona, the turquoise and silver and yellow mosaic tiles. The bitterness of the iced coffee she drank at Casa Amiral, made sweeter by Alexander's juvenile kisses. The blanket of stars overhead as they stumbled back to the circus, hand in hand, drunk on young romance. And then the headiness of gold champagne. Sweet smell of alcohol and sweat mingled on their clothing. The blue fabric covering her and falling asleep next to him, feeling safe. She wanted all of that. She wanted all of that and more. Where would you like to go? They tore through the night past tiny gold halos of light from the lampposts that lined the city streets and flooded the sky. The old memories resurfaced and Lena rested her hand on Alexander's shoulder. When the cab reached the city's core, Alexander insisted they get out and walk along the banks of the Seine. He borrowed 2 cashmere blankets from the motel attendants, and promising to return them the next day, they wrapped themselves in them and began to stroll along the edge of the famous waterway as they caught each other up on their lives. Alexander told her he'd been living in Paris for the last 5 years. He had a weekly residency in Musée Grévin, and for part of the year he toured Europe. The rest of the time, he didn't belong to any circus, preferring to do things on his own. I have more control this way. He talked about wanting to visit America and told her he'd received many invitations from a wealthy oil sheik who urged him to relocate to the Middle East. There's a lot of money to turn down, he said as they approached the Pont Marie. But for now, he was content with having Paris as his base. He led, from what Lena could glean, a peripatetic existence, and she wondered if it was solely because of his work or a piece of the young, scared boy that she knew still lived within him, forever running from his past. After he finished filling her in on his life, he asked her what she'd been up to, and Lena launched into her own explanation, wondering how she could possibly summarize 10 years of living into a few hours. She told him about boarding school and Olivia and what it was like with Clara and Fitz and their kids, and she told him about the market she visited every Saturday morning in Clerkenwell, and how, because it was run mainly by Italian immigrants, it reminded her of Mario and Anna Maria. She talked about teaching at Clara's school. I enjoy it, and the children are lovely, but, She paused, watching the street lamps illuminate. Well, you know better than I do what I've always wanted. Alexander cocked his head and was quiet for a minute. And this chap you're with, Harry, is it? Lena blushed. Yes. He's okay with you going to school? He's a photojournalist, she explained, so he's used to travel. Alexander let out a low whistle. Sounds smart, but not as smart as you. No one's as smart as you. Lena looked away, her eyes falling on a group of rowdy young men sharing a bottle of wine a few feet from them. Despite the late hour, there were still many people out enjoying the magic of the Parisian capital. Every so often, someone would stop to stare at Lena, resplendent in her dress, but she didn't care. He is smart, she answered eventually, meeting Alexander's gaze. I'm very lucky. Alexander smiled and wandered down to the tip of the river bank, stopping just short of the water's edge. Do you remember how we'd always skim stones along Ladalica? I don't know if that's right. He asked, taking off the blanket and kneeling it on the grass. Lena nodded, watching him pick through the stones and finally procuring a few flat ones. He stood up and began skimming them across the body of water, leaning forward to reach the perfect angle. He was getting dangerously close to the edge, and Lena, worried about his safety, hiked up her dress and rushed down to him. Move back. Alexander laughed. That was what you always used to tell me. Move back. You're too close. It's too dangerous. He skimmed a few more stones, not paying attention to her warning. Move, Lena said more urgently, arriving by his side. She took off her blanket so that she could move her arms more freely and tried to tug him closer to the grass. Alexander turned to her, a glint in his eyes. Or what? Or you'll fall in. Lena couldn't help but laughing, their faux argument bringing out a side of her she'd kept hidden for so long. You mean like this? And suddenly she was in his arms, and then there was a splash, and they were underwater, her dress billowing out around her, her shoes floating off her feet. Alexander clasped his hands around her waist and pulled her up for air. She burst through the surface of the river, taking in a huge breath, and she raised her hands to push him back. Alexander Robichaud, Lena spluttered. She grabbed for his neck, fearful that she might sink, but Alexander had a firm grasp on her and was keeping her afloat. She glanced around self-consciously, noticing passerbys come to the edge of the bank. It's okay, we're okay, Alexander sang out merrily as he treaded water, one arm wrapped tightly around Lena's waist. Wet tendrils of hair clung to Lena's face. She shivered as a light breeze wafted over her exposed shoulders. She tried to scowl. Alexander might still be caught in the world of magic, but this wasn't who she was now. She was a grown woman. Alexander, she began sternly, but he was laughing at her, laughing with an abandonment that she hadn't seen in him before. This Alexander was free and unburdened, moving through life as though he had nothing to lose. Try as she might, Lena couldn't escape from the feeling flowing through her. A surge of elation swirled in her ribs, threatening to burst through her chest. She loved Harry, but being with Alexander felt so right, like a missing piece of a puzzle finding its home. Come, you'll catch a chill, he said as he swam with her in his arms to the banks. He helped her out as she tried to wring out as much of the water from her dress as she could, but it was completely ruined. Her shoes were nowhere to be found, but oddly enough, she didn't care. She'd let Alexander drape one of the cashmere blankets around her shoulders. Well, he said, looking out at the river, at least you found your spot for a morning dip when you're in school. Lena hesitated, her mind flitting to Harry, to the welding, and to the life that was waiting for her back in London. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders tightly. I'm not sure I'm going. Alexander smirked. Nonsense, you have to go. I don't have to do anything, she said, suddenly irritated. People change. Alexander gaped at her. You spent the past 2 hours going on and on about how exciting the curriculum sounded. You're going. It's not that simple, Lena began. It is. You're the one making it hard. Alexander scuffed concrete part of the bank with his foot, frowning. What did you think was going to happen? Lena asked, her anger flaring. That you'd show up to my hotel room and I'd leave my entire life behind for you? I love Harry, and I know it hurts you to hear that, But it's the way it is. Alexander's mouth fell open. That's why you think I tried so hard to find you? Because I wanted to ruin your engagement? He shook his head. Lena, I came to London because I know what it's like to be an orphan. Theo isn't even your real father, and yet he loves you more than my father ever loved me. His eyes glimmered freely. If there was even the slimmest chance of my mother being alive, I would walk to the end of the earth to find her. I tracked you down because I wanted you to have a second chance with Theo, not because I expected you to wait for me. Lena inhaled sharply, unsure of how to respond. She stared at the ground and caught sight of a field mouse right before it scurried off into one of the crevices lining the banks. As for Harry, at what point tonight have I asked you to leave him? Alexander challenged. He waited, watching Lena's face flame red. Exactly, he finished off. He raked his hand through his hair and then let it fall across his face as it was wont to do. Look, marry him or don't marry him, but whatever you decide, at least have the courage to finish what your mother couldn't. He sighed and held out his hand. Let's get back. I don't want you getting sick. Oh my God. This is really intense, but they are blowing up my chat. So I'm repeating this a few times so you can hear it. I'm just pausing for a second. I promise I will be right back, but they are incessant. Hold on, please. Okay. Sorry about that. Is it registering again? Am I alive again? I don't know if you can see me. Can you see me? Can everyone hear me? Just the water, I think. The last 3 books, water. Yeah, there's a lot of water in these books. Yeah. I don't think it makes a bit of difference knowing that he's her uncle. He's still her father. All right, here we go. On the train ride back to London, Lena thought about her breakfast with Theo that day. He'd come to her hotel as promised, and they'd spent the morning trying to catch up on the last 10 years. And then he'd dropped her at the station, promising to visit her in London. As she glanced at the green fields passing by her window, Lena twisted her ring. In the best of circumstances, she imagined she might have a different choice to make. Cambridge or Oxford, Kings or Guys. Never in her life that she imagined she'd been trying to choose between 2 men. On the one hand, she had Harry, a man she loved dearly and whom she'd carved out the beginning stages of an adult life with. She thought about the things that they'd planned to do, all the trips that they wanted to take, and when they'd driven out to Brighton that past September, she'd swung her legs giddily as they'd sat on the pier overlooking the water, and she'd listened to Harry talk about how he'd hoped they'd bring up their children there one day. Nothing better for kids than a good dose of sea air and some handmade fudge, he said, wrapping his arms around her. How could she give up a promise of a good life with a decent man? Not to mention her life in London, Clara and Olivia, and the routine that she'd created for herself. There was a kind of solace in the certainty, and after a life of tumult, she wasn't sure that she'd risk not knowing what would happen in her future again. Her memories with Alexander were just that, memories. They were both adults now, hardened by the passage of time and the hardships that they'd endured. Who knew if they could ever rekindle what they'd had as kids? They were so young when they'd fallen in love, she reminded herself. And she couldn't overlook the fact that Alexander had lied to her for years. Harry had never lied to her. If anything, she thought, frowning, she had lied to him. But how could she forget that night that she'd spent with Alexander? It scared her how strongly her old feelings came flooding back, how easy it was to slip back into what they had, and she couldn't ignore the fact that even being able to go to medical school was in part due to what he'd glimpsed in her as a child. When everyone else was busy telling her what she couldn't do, Alexander had always seen what she could. As the gray streets of London came into view and the train lurched into Victoria Station, Lena was reminded of something that Olivia had said to her. She'd phoned her from the hotel the morning she got back from her night out with Alexander, and she explained everything. I don't know what to do, she'd whispered softly, wrapping the phone cord around her finger. But it's not about Harry or Alexander, is it? Lena frowned. Is it not? Olivia laughed. Of course not. You already know what choice you need to make, and it doesn't involve a man. She'd been right, Lena thought now. She stood up to get her suitcase from the rack, smoothed down her coat lapels, and adjusted her hat as she waited for the passengers in front of her to disembark. Though she was tired, she was eager to see Clara, desperate to tell her everything that had transpired over a cup of hot tea. There was much to sort out. Theo had already phoned Clara to make amends, and now he was planning to come to London and stay a few weeks to get reacquainted with all of them. As she stepped off the train, she inhaled deeply, relishing the smell of petrol mixed with soot newsprint, and Cornish pasties. To anyone else, it was an off-putting aroma, but trains had a special place in her heart. All the best things, she thought, happened on trains. Picking up her suitcase, she began pushing through the crowd towards the exit when she heard someone call her name. Lena! She turned around and saw Harry. Her Harry. He was standing on the platform holding a bouquet of daisies in one hand. With the other, he removed his hat and looked straight at her, holding the apology he hadn't been able to verbalize. In that moment, Lena knew exactly what she had to do.
Why does she keep doing this to us?
5 months later.
5 months later. 5 months later.
Okay, it's okay. It's fine. Chapter 47. August 1952. Delhi, India. Harry gripped the metal rung on the side of the rickshaw as the driver steered precariously through the streets of the Indian capital. Bump, 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 they went. Harry's stomach was churning as though he were on a deadly amusement park ride. Thick smog hung in the air, and he blinked rapidly, trying to adjust his eyes and get rid of the dust particles that had nestled their way in. "Sir is wanting any robe and rug, shawls?" the driver shouted over the din of the traffic. Taking one hand off the wheel, he slowed to a crawl and swept his hands toward the cluster of storefronts they were passing. Harry stroked the camera in his lap. The idea of haggling in the mid-afternoon heat was unappealing, but he decided it would be worth it if he chanced upon another photographic opportunity. "For you, best price," the driver continued, an unmistakable whiff of hope in his voice. "Okay," Harry said, "but I may not buy anything." Yes, just looking," the driver said eagerly as he turned on the ignition. Harry slung his camera strap around his neck and jumped down from the rickshaw and paused to inhale. India had an interesting scent. It hit you as soon as you arrived, a mix of petrol, spices, sweat, and ambition. Once a relatively tepid government city, Delhi had boomed post-partition. No longer wedged under the heavy fist of colonialism, the place was abuzz with a burgeoning entrepreneurial spirit. Harry saw it everywhere he went, from the fruit stall owners offering 2-for-1 deals to misshapen mangoes to the children who surfaced each time the Sorry. Where was I? He was each time the vehicle came to a stop in the busy traffic, buckets of soapy water and sponges at the ready. Harry followed the driver as he muscled his way into the first shop, a tiny sliver of a place. He stopped at the threshold, lifting his camera to snap a few photographs. It was amazing the way vendors managed to pack so many goods into a tight space, he thought, capturing rows upon rows of colored fabric bolts stacked onto the ceiling. "Something for Missimbai?" the shop owner asked as Harry lowered his camera to approach the counter. "This Kashmiri wool, he continued, holding out a cerulean shawl, very warm, very thin. Harry reached out and ran his hand over the fabric, picturing Lena wrapping it around her shoulders, her dark hair in contrast. And then he frowned, remembering the look on her face the day that she returned from Paris. He'd known something was different the minute he set his eyes on her on that platform. Later that evening, as she intertwined her fingers with his while retelling the tale of her long-lost father and a boy named Alexander to gobsmacked Clara, Harry watched, an uneasiness taking root in his gut like a slow-growing cancer, barely detectable at first, but unstoppable in the end. It was as though a previously dormant fire within her had caught a passing flame and was now fighting its way back to full strength. That first night back, she told him passionately but firmly that she had to go to medical school and she would join him after he'd finished, and she asked him to join her after he'd finished his assignment in India. "What's 6 months apart? I'll be too busy studying to have any fun anyway," she said, her eyes sparkling as she brushed her hair, and Harry's heart had melted, reassured that despite the unreal turn of events, she still wanted him. So he'd agreed and started to make the necessary arrangements, going so far as to interview with the Associated Press. He kept telling himself that the change of plans was a good thing, that Lena was getting what she'd wanted, and the future included him. But 5 more weeks before their wedding, Harry could no longer ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. Lena's energy and attention were increasingly consumed with planning for medical school and rebuilding her relationship with Theo. She'd nod politely as he read passages from travel guides and smiled briefly whenever he added a thumbtack to the map of India that hung in his office, marking yet another place that he wanted to show her. But something inside her had shifted, like a piece of ice that had finally broken free from a large berg and was finally drifting slowly away. As he watched her one night, talking animatedly about all the pastéries she was going to take Olivia to when she visited, he knew that she no longer belonged to him. He'd broken it off with as much dignity as he could, refusing to engage in a game of finger-pointing. He'd come to her one morning and said that he was having trouble finding a more suitable job in Paris, and that as much as he wanted to go with her, he couldn't give up on his career. She cried, devastated at the thought of losing the life that they'd planned together. Her sadness had quickly turned to anger, and she beat her fists against his chest, telling him that he simply needed to try harder. In a final act of defiance, she wrote to the university requesting that they defer her acceptance a year. When, 3 weeks later, she received confirmation that they would, she thrust the letter in his face as though it were physical proof that Harry needed of her undying commitment to him, that there was still time for him to change his mind. Harry felt terrible, but he knew her attempts to keep them together were in vain. No matter what he said or did, it always felt like he was holding her back. And even if she didn't understand it, he knew that the only way Lena could go to Paris and succeed was to do so unburdened by anything and anyone. And so, in his final act of love for her, he did what he had to and set her free. "Sir," the shopkeeper pointed to a row of shawls, bright pink, sage green, and mustard yellow. "Perhaps you like embroidery?" He jerked his head at an assistant who scurried to the back. No, nothing. Thank you," Harry said, walking out of the shop. He could hear the driver scurrying along behind him, trying to keep pace. "Sir is wanting to see anything else? Some carpets?" Harry stopped and bit his lip. He knew this was par for the course. Any driver he hired would have done the same thing, but he was tired of feigning interest in the merchandise each time he ventured out. "I'm going to look around. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Without waiting for the driver to protest, Harry set off, picking his way around the shops and stalls, searching for a captivating subject to photograph. Since arriving in India 4 weeks earlier, he'd focused solely on work, grateful to have something to keep his mind occupied. But his workload at the Daily Express didn't take up all of his time, so he began pitching freelance pieces to other news outlets and magazines. So far, he had a photo essay on the Dalle Ganmang, changing culture, accepted in Italy's Corriere della Sera just last week. An American magazine had contacted him about a series documenting the influx of Sikh refugees and what it meant for the city's infrastructure. Harry quickly found that photographing the mundane, daily activities of ordinary people was preferable to snapping in another dignitary or corrupt official at a state dinner. He couldn't pinpoint when the shift happened, but lately he'd been finding people of importance tedious. They were always full of stock cliches, too bothered about their own reputations to say anything of significance or really let their guard down. So Harry began venturing out on his own, shooting everything he saw. He captured photos of men who had their legs amputated, of Muslim families forced out of their homes by Hindu extremists, of the farmers' children who traveled for days to get to the nation's capital in hope of securing a better life, only to discover the reality was bitter and disappointing, and of mothers delivering babies on dirt floors, anguish seared into their foreheads. Pain, elation, boredom, and happiness, whatever their emotions, he challenged himself to capture it all. A split second forever frozen in time. Words couldn't always describe a moment, but a carefully taken photograph could. He smiled as he passed a stall owner peddling miniature limestone statues of Ganesh, but the man averted his eyes, twisting his body away from Harry. Despite having gained independence 5 years earlier, much of India still felt like it was trying to free itself from the shackles of imperialism, and it was this that Harry saw in the glances sometimes that came his way. He didn't blame them for distrusting him, but he was sure he would have done the same. The row of shops eventually tapered off, giving way to the rundown residential area, and Harry stopped in front of one of the huts, its entire front removed so that anyone passing by could look in, observing the lives of the residents. In front of the space where a door should have been, 3 boys kicked a deflated football back and forth, bursting into laughter one minute and arguing the next. A woman who looked like their mother stood nearby, beating out the dust of a jute mat. A bit farther back, an elderly woman, Harry assumed was the grandmother. She squatted over a hearth, shaping pieces of fat dough onto a steel tray, shaping them into circular rounds with a thin wooden stick. But it was the little girl who caught his eye. She was standing calmly at the edge of the house, watching Harry. Her eyes were deep brown, full of wonder and curiosity. He took a step closer, expecting her to dart to the safety of the folds of her mother's sari, but she didn't move. She couldn't have been more than 3, but she seemed to possess maturity and street smarts of someone far older. "Sir, there are no shops here." Harry groaned softly as the driver materialized at his side and pointed to his camera. "Could you please ask the mother if I can take some photos?" The driver nodded and went to speak to the mother while Harry dug around in his pocket for some coins. The mother dropped to the mat that she was beating, wiping a sheen of sweat from her forehead as she approached Harry. "5 annas," she said. Harry counted out the change. She smiled a gap-toothed grin and pushed her boys forward, speaking to them in an authoritative voice, which Harry understood to be mean. Understood to mean stand up straight and smile properly. Harry's camera whirled to life as the boys stood in front of him, chest puffed out, teeth gleaming against tanned skin, not unlike the soldiers who fought for their freedom. "She says these boys are our future," the driver said. "She wants them to go abroad, have degrees from English college." Harry smiled. "Tell her I hope they get the chance." He clicked a few more photographs of the boys and then pointed to the girl. "What about her?" The mother shrugged and said something to the driver. "She said if you want, you can take photo." Harry thanked the mother and approached the girl who hadn't let her gaze slip. He held out his camera, but she reached up and touched his hand. And then Harry lifted his eyes and began shooting. He snapped photo after photo, praying that at least one of them would capture her steely determination. The mother had given a stick of Betty to the driver, and then he called out to Harry, now spitting tobacco juice on the ground. "She say, everybody have hope, before none. Now New India is here." Harry nodded as he continued clicking away until he finished the roll of film. He glanced behind him. The mother and the boys were engaged in discussion with the driver, and the grandmother had moved on to chopping vegetables. No one was paying attention to the girl. Taking a deep breath, Harry quickly bent down and pressed a few coins into the youngster's palm. He watched, his heart breaking slightly as she swiftly tucked them into her pocket of her simple dress, away from prying eyes. It was a gesture that both pained him and made him proud. Already accustomed to being treated like a lower-class citizen because of her caste and gender, Harry hoped that she would use this money to her advantage and fight for what was rightfully hers. He stood up and scuffed to the ground with the back of his shoe, kicking a cloud of red dust up around his ankles. "Right," he said, wandering back to the mother and the boys, thanking them for their time. "Could you drop me off at the office?" he asked the driver. "Sir is not wanting to go to the hotel." "I want to develop these." The driver shrugged and started walking towards the rickshaw. Harry followed him but stopped when he was halfway there. He turned back to get one last look at the girl. As expected, she was still watching him, her gaze steady. He thought he could see a small smile on her face, like she was now the keeper of a secret neither of them would ever share. Harry stayed up all night developing the photos, the chemical smell of the dark room providing an odd source of comfort. As the liquid dripped off the edges of the picture, he smiled, and he hoped that the pictures of the girl really stood out. He knew as he stood in the dim light that he'd captured something truly special. It was more than a picture. It was an attitude, a statement, as if she was challenging anyone who dared to doubt her. It was as if she was saying, "I know my lot in life, but I'm not going to accept it." And a week later, Harry would tuck one of the photographs of the girl into a letter that he wrote to Lena, hoping that she would open it and immediately feel what he felt. He couldn't have known at the time, but 14 years later, Indira Gandhi would succeed Lal Bahadur Shastri as the leader of the Congress Party, becoming the first female Prime Minister of India. As Harry watched Nehru's daughter from the corner of the comfort of the home he shared with his wife and 2 children, he would be reminded of the photograph he'd taken of the little girl with the arresting gaze. She would be grown up now, he thought. He leaned forward in his armchair, wondering what had become of that family. Had the boys made it to England? Would their mother be proud? But mostly he wondered about the girl. He hoped that wherever she was watching Indira with the same intensity that he'd captured with his camera. And he'd hoped that she would go on to defy the odds, just like any other remarkable woman that he'd once known. Oof. It's a long chapter. Hold on. Give me 2 seconds. Okay, sorry. I got a really stupid text message while I was reading that last chapter and it completely threw me off. Can you hear me again now? It's been a long time. We've been on here for a really, really long time. Should we finish it? I mean, we only have 1 chapter left. And the chapter is... Yeah? Yeah, okay. Here we go. Last chapter. Chapter 48, October 1952, Paris, France. Can you hear me now? Good. Lena tugged her chair closer to her desk, feeling the feet scraping the wooden floor and the unfolded letter once again. It had arrived a few weeks ago in a pale blue envelope so thin that it was nearly translucent. Her name was scrawled onto the front, the last 4 letters hidden by the edge of a stamp depicting an intricate carved temple. She'd slit the edges of it open with a sharp kitchen knife, afraid that if she tried to use her fingers, she'd tear the words inside. Dear Lena, it began. She curled her right ankle around one leg of the chair, resting her cheek on her left hand as she read it for what might have been the 100th time. It's an exciting time. Change is rampant, Harry wrote. It's a privilege to observe what's going on during the rebirth. I'm staying at a hotel in the center of Delhi, not far from Khalifa Road, where the Prime Minister resides. Each morning, a maid brings me a steaming cup of chai, which I sip out on the veranda, watching the city emerge from its slumber. Most of my days are spent in a silent chronicle of a monumental historical shift. But it's the portraiture work I've been doing on my days off that I find most thrilling. I've included a photo that I hope you'll like. I spotted this little girl in a rundown residential street. There was something about her gaze, so determined and focused, that reminded me of you. I also clipped a few petals from the tuberose plant. They call it Rajinaha here. On the hotel veranda, and they put them in. And I put them in. I'm hoping you can still make out their heavenly scent. I truly hope you and your father are keeping well and that school is everything that you dreamed it would be. Take care, Harry. Lena looked at the photograph, trying to flatten its curled edges with the pad of her thumb. Each time she saw the girl's big, serious eyes, something stirred inside. Do we think his wife is Lena? I don't know. Each time she saw the girl's serious eyes, something stirred inside her and she smiled, feeling achingly content that if they had to be apart, at least Harry was doing something he loved. She scooped up a few of the dried petals in her palm and brought them closer to her nose. Closing her eyes, she inhaled not just the scent of the flowers, but a life that could have been, navigating the streets of Delhi as she walked to her job as a teacher at the local missionary, buying freshly ground spices from a local market, watching from the safety of a well-built house as a monsoon ripped through the city, and sipping hot ginger tea, a liquid warming her throat, as a reward for a hard day's work, all with a man who loved her. It wouldn't have been a bad life, she thought, opening her eyes, letting the petals fall back into the body of the letter before laying the photograph on top. But she was only beginning to acknowledge it wouldn't have made her happy. She folded the envelope up, wedging it neatly between the pages of a dictionary, and then glanced around her bedroom. She'd arrived in the French capital in August with little more than the clothes in a trunk. At first, she said she would take up residence in a woman's rooming house, but Theo had insisted she stay with him, at least until she was settled. There was 2 bedrooms in his flat, he'd pointed out, and with his touring schedule, she'd have the place to herself for a few months of the school year. You'd be doing me a favor, he explained. I wouldn't need to find someone to look after it. Lena had gratefully accepted, and not only because she was excited at the prospect of having more time to spend with Theo. Up until a few months ago, she truly thought Harry would be by her side as she stepped into her new life, but with him gone, she needed every bit of support she could get. Lena sighed as she surveyed her desk. It was littered with anatomical sketches and of course notes sporting neat reminders that she'd scribbled to herself in the margins. She stacked a few sheets of paper into a pile and then paused, her mind elsewhere. She opened the top drawer of her desk and pulled out the packet of letters she'd exchanged with Alexander. They'd kept in touch following their reunion in Paris. He'd come to visit her in London once, taking great joy in being able to see not only her, but Clara and her family. It felt like old times, easy and carefree. After he returned to Paris, they continued writing letters, but after a few weeks, the letters slowed, and eventually Lena stopped writing. She told herself he'd likely gotten too busy touring, that his silence had nothing to do with her relationship with Harry. The last time they'd had any contact was in May. By June, her engagement was off, and she'd been too upset to tell him. Lena thought about the irony of the situation as she flickered the letters, reading snippets of their exchanges. How could she spend a decade missing someone only to let him slip out of her life again so easily? She kept telling herself that she reached out when she felt ready, but as the sleepy Paris summer turned to autumn, she wondered if she was being entirely honest. She assumed her father had told Alexander about the wedding being called off. The fact that he hadn't been in touch despite this only confirmed what he'd said the night at the Seine. Being with Lena was never his endgame. He'd merely wanted to reunite her and Theo, and for her to know the truth about who Theo was. Selena focused on the opportunity to do what she'd always wanted. She threw herself into school, arriving at lectures early, staying long after they'd ended. She spent that extra time in the labs or the library, filling her head with facts about the respiratory and cardiovascular systems. It was better this way, she reasoned. With her workload ballooning and exams looming, there was nothing to distract her from doing her best. She stood up, shoving her books into an acry leather satchel, a gift from Clara and Fitz for starting medical school. As she slipped her feet into a pair of pale pink ballet flats and made her way to the kitchen, she reminded herself it wasn't a bad thing that he'd not been in touch. Her heart had been through enough. "Good morning," she greeted Theo, who was taking brief sips of coffee in between chopping ingredients for breakfast over the stove. "Lena!" He was beaming when he held up a fistful of fresh herbs. "Do you have time to eat?" I'm going to be late," Lena replied, glancing quickly at her watch and realizing the time. The one pleasure Lena allowed herself was time with her father. Often the two of them would be up until the early hours of the morning trying to make up for lost time. They'd play gin rummy and drink Restina, and Theo would tell Lena stories about her mother and their childhood in Athens. They'd done this last night, and the late hours she'd gone to bed, coupled with the fact that she'd spent part of her morning rereading Harry's letter, meant that she was uncharacteristically late. "You sure?" Theo gestured to the eggs, tossing in a handful of chopped basil. "Yes," Lena said, bustling about the kitchen in search of something that she could eat on the run. "At least let me make you a panini," Theo said. He plucked a fresh baguette off the table and sliced it in half, white crumbs falling across the wooden chopping board. "Papa," Lena warned, watching her father stuck a spoon into a jar of fresh pesto, spreading big dollops onto the bread. "Now for some cheese," he murmured, opening the fridge. Lena pursed her lips. But the truth was she valued every minute they had together and wasn't going to waste any energy being frustrated with him. She plopped her bag on the kitchen chair and stepped onto the Juliet balcony. The flat was in Montmartre district, not far from Sacré-Cœur. The neighborhood had a bohemian, artistic vibe, and it suited her father perfectly. They'd often strolled the streets at night or visited one of the many cafes in the morning, sipping lattes as they read the day's issue of Le Monde. As Theo sliced up chunks of brie, he glanced at his daughter. He'd been overjoyed when she confirmed that she was moving to Paris and had immediately insisted she stay with him. He didn't think he'd ever tire of looking at her, admiring how much she'd overcome to get where she was. He'd be lying if he said he didn't have pangs of regret, how much more she could have achieved if he hadn't been so protective when she was younger. But, as they both knew all too well, life was short, and there was no merit to be found in dwelling on the past. He'd been wanting to ask more about what happened with Harry, the ring noticeably absent from her finger ever since she'd arrived, but he respected her privacy and he hadn't pushed. For the most part, she was in good spirits, thrilled that something she'd dreamed about for years was finally coming true. Oof. Yet some days, Theo sensed a melancholy weighing her down, like she was yearning for something or someone else. There, Theo announced, rolling up the panini in wax paper. Remember, I'm performing tonight. You'll be okay on your own? Lena nodded, biting into an apple that she'd taken from the fruit bowl. Theo hesitated as he watched her, his mind flitting back to Alexander. He thought about the letter he'd received from him. If it had been any other two people, he would have stayed out of it, but he knew these two like the back of his hand, and life had taught him that one had to take risks, no matter how terrifying. He leaves tonight. Lena stopped chewing, feeling a trickle of tart apple juice slide down her chin. She wiped her jaw with the back of her sleeve and swallowed. Theo dumped the chopping board into the sink and turned on the tap. On the train to Bordeaux. He'll do a few shows, and then he'll head to London for 2 months, and then America for 4 more. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. He paused. I just thought you should know. Thank you, Lena said quietly and picked up her panini. I'll see you later. She rose up on her tiptoes and kissed Theo gently on the cheek. You didn't do anything wrong. What? Lena spoke so quietly her voice was barely audible. With Harry, Theo said softly. You don't have to punish yourself. Lena sighed. She appreciated that her father hadn't asked about her personal life, that he'd allowed her to grieve and move on as she saw fit, but she knew that at some point she couldn't ignore everything that she'd been feeling, and it might help to talk about it, even just a little bit. I heard a good man, she whispered, feeling her voice break. Theo turned off the tap and wiped his hands on a towel before putting an arm around Lena's shoulders comfortingly. You made a choice and offered him one too. You couldn't control what he did. He gently tipped Lena's chin upward. Alexander, he'd want to see you. I'm too busy with school, she said abruptly, swallowing her grief. Besides, if he wanted to hear from me, then he would have said something. He would have replied to my letters. Theo frowned. Lena, he doesn't know about Harry. You didn't tell him? Didn't think it was my place. Lena frowned, letting this realization sink in. She shook her head. It doesn't change anything. He's leaving. I only needed 2 days with Isabella to know she was the one. You two have had far more time than that. Theo smiled, his dark eyes crinkling. Life's fickle, Lena. If you have a chance to be happy, take it. Lena stared out at the blue sky. It looked perfect, almost unreal. It was the kind of day where everything was supposed to go right. She took another bite of her apple and grabbed her satchel. Good luck tonight, she called as she walked down the stairs of the building. Good luck tonight? What kind of theater... The audacity. 8 hours later, Lena sat in a classroom, twisting her neck from side to side. She was 15 minutes into her final lecture of the day, and the class was discussing a case in which an operation to correct a cardiac shunt had been performed using induced hypothermia. Cooling the body's temperature was the key factor in its success, the professor explained. By keeping the body in a hypothermic state, less oxygen was required for it to function. Dr. Bigelow's pioneering technology has a wide range of implications for the entire cardiological field. A young man 2 seats over from Lena raised his hand. How do you know it's safe to use in other surgical procedures? Well, you can't know. All you can do is make the best possible educated guess, the professor answered. But understand this, if it's utilized to its full potential, the cooling of the heart could change the face of surgery as we know it. And what about the risks? Lena heard herself ask. What's the risk if you don't do anything? The professor countered. In the case of a shunt, the patient, a 5-year-old girl, likely wouldn't have survived. Surely, we need more evidence before pushing something like this into the mainstream, Lena said. And at what point will we ever have enough proof? Where do we draw the line? The professor asked. When Lena didn't answer, he continued. Each decision we make, no matter how mundane, involves the element of chance. Everything from the food we eat, to the relationships we enter into, to the jobs we pursue. We calculate the pros and cons and then make the best choice we can using the information we have. It's the same with medicine. You can weigh the benefits and the risks all you want, but at some point you have to dive in and hope that the odds are in your favor. The room was awash with the murmurs, and the morals and ethical issues weighed on everyone's minds in these budding physicians. Isn't it a bit reckless? Lena offered. Isn't inaction a bit reckless? Not giving this young girl a chance to live doesn't seem fair, given what we know from past experience, the professor said, not unkindly. He waited for the class to quiet down. What I'm saying is, the will to go against much of the training you're about to embark on, no matter how much you learn from these, he said, picking up a textbook, You'll inevitably be faced with real-life situations you can't prepare for. After 30 years of practicing medicine, the only thing I know for certain is that the absence of evidence, we have to have blind faith. That will be difficult for many of you to fathom, but we're used to process, procedure, and moving from point A to point B, knowing what the end result will be. The truth is, progress in medicine, progress in anything, cannot exist without ambiguity and risk. Lena sat in her seat, the chorus of voices around her fading away as Clara's fateful words took hold in her mind. Try or don't try. The time will pass anyway. Professor, she called out, leaping up and grabbing her satchel. I've just remembered there's somewhere I have to be. I'm so sorry. She rushed towards the exit. A few seconds later, she pushed open the doors of the university and flew down the steps en route to the train station. She didn't know what she was doing, but she knew that if she stopped to think about it rationally, she would talk herself out of it. She strode north, past the Pont Marie, and up through the Marais district. With each step, she felt her confidence boom. It'll be okay, she told herself over and over again, till it became a mantra. She kept walking, not stopping to think about the blister forming on her heel or the sweat that had accumulated around the waistband of her skirt. By the time she reached the station's entrance, her feet were aching, scolding herself for a poor choice of footwear as she ran to the terminal. She promised to reward herself with a glass of red wine afterwards to soothe her throbbing toes. Right now, she had no time to lose. Rushing up to the ticket office, she tapped on the window. Excuse me, where can I find the train leaving for Bordeaux? Platform 7, the agent answered. Lena thanked him and began to hurry off, scanning the platform signs. As soon as she spotted number 7, she broke into a run, ignoring the pain in her legs, not stopping until she reached the train's first-class cabin. As she stopped outside, her satchel, which had been flying behind her, smacked her hip. She let out a howl of pain. Breathless, she hunched over, inhaling big gulps of air, and when she caught her breath, she rushed to the conductor. Please, sir, I have to get on. Your ticket, mademoiselle? I haven't got one. There's someone I need to see. With no ticket, I cannot let you on. I'll come back off, I promise. I need to speak with someone on there, Lena pleaded, pointing to the train. No, the conductor said firmly, beckoning to the couple behind her to come forward. Lena stepped back, trying to figure out the next move. Tucking a few strands of loose hair behind her ears, she craned her neck, trying to gauge the carriage's length. It would take her too long to run up and down each side, and even if she did, Alexander wouldn't know that she was looking for him. She glanced at the conductor again, and they did something entirely out of character. Stop! She yelled, pointing to someone behind further up the platform. Thief! Stop him! The conductor turned around, and Lena used the split-second distraction to leap onto the train. Not wasting a minute, she pushed open the door to the first-class carriage and began walking in quite quickly as she could down the aisle, squeezing herself between the passengers, stowing their luggage as they prepared for the journey ahead. Alexander, she called, looking right and left, only to be met with a confused face, one after another. As she moved further down the aisle, her stomach began to dip uneasily. What if he changed his plans and wasn't on this train at all? After all this time, she finally mustered up the courage to tell him how she felt, and now he wasn't around to hear it. Alexander, she called, feeling a little more desperate. Stop, mademoiselle! Lena stole a glance over her shoulder and saw the conductor catching up to her. Not willing to give up, she quickened her pace, apologizing as she maneuvered her way around a young girl and her mother. Mademoiselle! Just then, a rough hand clamped down on Lena's shoulder. She stopped walking, squeezed her eyes shut, and cursed softly under her breath. Feeling guilty, she turned around, trying to think of an explanation that would get her out of trouble. Lena? Lena whipped her head back to see Alexander sitting just a few seats in front of where she stood now. Oh, thank goodness, she said, relieved. He stepped into the aisle and came towards her, dumbfounded. What are you doing here? I need to speak with you. Please, she said, trying to wriggle out of the conductor's grasp. Tell him I'm with you. Alexander stepped forward and exchanged a few words with the conductor, who reluctantly let go of Lena's arm. Come, Alexander said, steering Lena out of the carriage. You'll miss your train, she protested as they approached the exit. A hot blast of steam hissed from underneath the tracks, and Lena stepped down. The cough and the water and the smoke curled up inside her nostrils. I'm right next to it, Alexander answered, a slight smirk on his face as he joined her on the platform. He glanced up and down the station and looked back in disbelief, raking a hand through his hair. You visiting Theo? Lena frowned, a wave of guilt crashing over her. She fiddled with the straps of her satchel, massaging a sore spot from where it had dinged her collarbone. Well, the thing is, she trailed off, meeting Alexander's gaze and shrugging like she'd been defeated. Alexander's eyes widened. Wait, you're in school? Yes. I only found out today that my father hadn't told you, she said bashfully, her cheeks going red. As difficult as the breakup had been, Lena didn't think she'd ever tire of telling those who'd known her that she was finally on the right path. Alexander looked at her, confused. I've not seen him for months. I only got home from my summer tour 3 days ago. I did write to him telling him I'd be in town now, but I assumed he was visiting you. I meant to call him, but it's been ridiculous trying to prepare for another 6 months away. He shook his head, but enough about that. You did it! You accepted the spot! Alexander swept Lena off the platform into a pleased hug. I'm so pleased, he continued huskily, his eyes glittering with admiration as he put her down. Let me guess, you're the top student, and all the others hate you for it, he teased. Hardly, she said, swatting at him playfully. Alexander laughed. And Harry? He scanned the crowd for Lena's fiancé. Is he settled in? He's, in India. We didn't get married, Lena said in a resigned voice as she waited for him to reply. She wondered if she ever uttered the words as a simple fact and not a feeling, and she wondered if she would ever utter those words as a simple fact and not feel a rush of sadness. Alexander! Lena jerked her head towards the train as a young woman was leaning out the window, one arm nestled on the frame, the other beckoning to Alexander elegantly. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, a few delicate wisps framing her face, her lips painted a deep red. Hurry up! 2 minutes, Alexander shouted back. The woman frowned at Lena and disappeared back inside the carriage. Lena suddenly knew why Alexander had stopped writing and why he hadn't inquired after her. He'd moved on, she thought, the realization washing over her like being doused in ice water. Sorry, Alexander said, distracted. About Harry. It's fine, Lena whispered, her throat feeling like it was closing up. What was she doing, she thought? She'd walked out of a medical school lecture to tell a boy that she'd had a childhood crush on, that she still loved him. What was wrong with her? What did you need to tell me? Oh, it's nothing, actually. I should go, she said. Her heart felt like a balloon that had just been popped and was slowly deflating, the air sadly hissing out of it. Worried she might cry, she turned to make a swift exit, but Alexander grabbed her wrist. Don't leave like that. You're obviously busy. She shot a glance back at the train. She's a performer on the tour, Alexander said, raising his eyebrows. Lena felt her cheeks redden, and sheepishly she let her arms go slack in his grip. Oh, Lena, Alexander said, watching her carefully. Why are you here? Lena wished he would stop asking her questions and put 2 and 2 together. Wasn't it obvious? Why else would she come? She glanced at the clock. 17:56, 4 minutes for her to tell him, or he'd be off and gone for months. Alexander let out an exasperated sigh and pointed to the carriage. Her husband is sitting next. I'll be 28, Lena blurted out. What? I'll be 28 when I finish school, she continued, standing up straighter. Maybe 30, practically an old maid by societal standards. What do you make of that? Alexander glanced at the clock and then back to Lena. Look, let me ring you from Bordeaux. I've no time for that, and neither do you, she said, lifting her chin, knowing that the words she was about to speak would defy what would happen next. I'll be 28 or 29 or 30, and I'm asking you if you'll wait for me. Alexander's hair flopped into his eyes, and Lena watched as he instinctively shook it off to the side, just like he'd always done when they were kids. Is this, am I what you really want? Lena twisted the dove bracelet around her wrist. She realized she'd been holding her breath, a tightness gripping her chest since she'd arrived. And if she was being honest, it had been there for months, since the day she realized he was alive, because the truth was, no matter how much she tried to explain it away, she loved him. You are. As she spoke the words, she'd been so afraid of releasing, freeing them into the open air. She felt as though an invisible weight was lifted. She waited for him to say something, never losing his gaze. Without warning, a loud whistle erupted from the train, and Lena jumped, clamping her hands over her ears, her heartbeat skyrocketing. To add insult to injury, the conductor blew his whistle, aiming in their direction, somehow managing to scowl at Lena while he did it. And Alexander still did nothing. He just stood on the platform, staring at her as though he were in some kind of trance. Eventually, the silence became too much, and Lena reached out to give Alexander a light hug. Have a safe trip, she said, smiling bravely. Sometimes she thought, as she started to turn around and walk away, not getting any answer was an answer in and of itself. At least now she knew. At least now she could focus entirely on school and not be left wondering what could have been. It's a long time, she heard him say. Lena stopped. Slowly, she looked back. Very, she said, taking a tentative step toward him. Longer than the distance from here to Mercury, Alexander said, a familiar hint of mischief beginning to swirl in his brilliant blue eyes. Yes, she nodded, gripping the strap of her satchel tightly, her knuckles turning white. 2 more steps. His face was still impartial, and Lena sucked in her breath, wondering how much longer he was going to wait before giving her some kind of sign of how he felt. And then all of a sudden she was spiraling back in time to the memories of her carriage on the World of Wonders, on the night of her 13th birthday, when Alexander had first admitted his true feelings and had kissed her, and she felt what it felt like to walk on air. Except it wasn't a memory, it was real. He was here. Now his lips pressed confidently against hers, one hand cupping the small of her back, holding her waist tightly, as though he would never let go. The conductor blew his whistle aggressively, and Lena and Alexander pulled apart, laughing as he shouted a final warning. Lena grasped Alexander's hand in hers, an unspoken agreement forged between them. So, she said, will you wait? Alexander nodded, and a smile burst across his face. I'll wait. And then he kissed her again, winked at the conductor, and darted onto the train. A moment later, Lena caught him sticking his head out the window, waving as the train took a huge breath and began pulling away from the station. 7 years later, Lena would stand proudly at her convocation, one of only 2 women in her class to graduate from medical school that year. She'd accepted her degree graciously as a cheering contingent that included Alexander, Theo, Clara, Olivia, looked on proudly, marveling at the woman she'd become. 2 months after Lena earned her degree, she and Alexander would run down the steps of St. Stephen's Greek Orthodox Cathedral on the Rue Jaurès-Bizet, bells ringing loudly as well-wishers tossed rose petals into the air. At the reception that followed at the Tuileries, Theo would raise a glass and tell the story of love between 2 people so strong that they endured a decade of heartbreak, loss, and distance, ultimately defying all odds to find each other again. And a year after their wedding, Lena would give birth to a baby girl, and she and Alexander would name her Aria. As they sat beaming at the bundle of light that had entered their lives, they promised to each other that their promise to teach each other their daughter's one past did not dictate future possibilities, that she alone had the power to decide who she would become, and that if rationality and logic ever failed her, she could always believe in magic. But for now, all Lena could do was focus on the present. She watched Alexander's train slink out of sight, waiting until the only thing left was a trail of white smoke and the memory of his kiss on her lips. And then she turned and walked towards the exit, elegantly dodging tourists who were oblivious to the happy ending and the new beginning that had just transpired. She passed under a magnificent archway and out onto the street, pausing to look up at the sky, no longer blue. It now resembled a watercolor painting, awash with swirls of mauve and dusty pink, the sun dipping slowly behind the clouds. As Lena walked down the Boulevard de la Champagne, in search of a suitable cafe where she could rest her feet, she thought she could hear the sound of her father's voice swept up in the warm Parisian breeze. Epimeno, Lena. Epimeno. At the end of the day, that was all she could do. Woo! That's really something. There's a pretty long author's note at the back of this, but I think we can read that another time. Okay, well, I'm gonna pop off here. We can talk about this elsewhere because I've been on here for too long and my voice is dry and I also have to pee. I love you all. This was a great book.